back to the Frugal Females Challenge, everybody. This month, Daysha Carter of Everyday Budgeting has been graciously providing tips and unpacking budgeting, debt, and expenses or spending for us. Today, we are going to be talking about savings. Last week, if you're just joining us, we covered or introduced a simple budgeting strategy. I highly encourage you guys to check it out. We will continue to post it and make it available. So again, this week we're going to be focusing on savings. So let's get started. Hi. Um, so when we're talking about savings, why is it important for our frugal females and frugal fellas well, what's the big deal anyways?
I'm so glad you asked, Heather. Savings is one of the most important things that you can do for yourself as an individual or as a family. You'll notice on our budget, I listed savings as the first expense. When I'm working with clients, one of the things that I try and hit home is a concept called pay yourself first, which means as soon as you get some income into your account or you cash a check, that you prioritize yourself and your future before you start to think about, what are my housing expenses or my food. And in doing so, you'll make sure that at the end of the month, you haven't run out of money before you have a chance to tuck a little bit away.
Oh, I love that idea, paying yourself first. We pay Comcast, we pay Visa, we pay Shell, Chevron, whichever. Paying myself first, that's a great way to think about savings. I always just think of it as, it's nice to have, but really, and as a matter of fact, as you pointed it out, having the first line item on your budget is savings. That's very different than what I think the typical American families are actually implementing in their lives.
Absolutely.
Before, you had mentioned another concept of an emergency fund. What is an emergency fund?
So an emergency fund is a pot of money that you've set aside for an emergency. My mom introduced me to this concept when I was going off to college. She reinforced that there was no such thing as a shoe emergency or a beer emergency.
A shoe emergency, that's great.
Yeah, so she was very strict about what emergency funds could be used for. And I've just carried that through personally and work on it with my clients as well. And basically what that pot of money can be used for is a truly surprise expense that can't be avoided, but that you don't necessarily want to go into debt or into more debt in order to cover. A great example might be if you're driving to work and you get a flat tire and need to replace your tire. That is definitely something that my mom would consider an emergency.
Sage advice from the elders. It's always good to listen to. So if I'm not in the habit of saving, especially for an emergency fund, if like things are very tight, what are do you have any advice for getting that started? How can you make it more manageable?
Absolutely. So the industry and professionals typically range in their advice and say that a good emergency fund is anywhere from 3 to maybe up to 8 months of your income. And I think that is an excellent, wonderful benchmark. But if you're just getting started and maybe do have a little bit of debt already, the idea of 3 to 8 months of income can be very daunting. It feels impossible.
Yes.
And so what I usually recommend to people is start with something small and manageable. So maybe $250 or $500, that it doesn't feel as difficult to achieve as, say, 8 months of income.
Yes, and that's very tempting, especially if you have a large mountain of debt, to keep that amount of money in your savings account and not put it in other places.
Yep.
Or spending it on other things. And so you said 3 months to 8 months worth?
Absolutely.
Is that of your total monthly income, or is that like what, just your expenses? Is that?
That's a good question. So the benchmark typically, industry professionals differ a little bit. Some say of your take-home pay, which is normally what we on our budget would include as our income. So that is a little bit different than your full pay, of course, because we have to pay taxes and insurance and things.
Mm-hmm.
Another option that sometimes is a little bit more manageable would be of your expenses, because obviously your expenses is what you're really going to have to be able to cover if something happened and you happen to lose your job or lose your primary source of income.
Heaven forbid that happens, and it happens often.
It does.
I recently read a report that said average American families, is very common every few years to experience a loss or gain of 25% of their annual income. And I think that having that savings or that emergency account is so important to mitigating that risk.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because you don't, if you already have a little bit of debt or some amount of debt, and really even if you have no debt, you don't necessarily want to have to rely upon your credit cards or, you know, an even higher interest loan to cover your everyday expenses. The other interesting thing, if you need to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room, is you don't necessarily have to save, you know, I'll say 8 months of your normal expenses if there is a chance that if you lost your income, then your expenses could go down. So certainly, you know, I have clients who have a normal standard of living, but when they lost their income, they stopped eating out so much. Their non-essential and fun line on the budget, went down pretty substantially. So you have to think about your expenses that likely isn't related to your income. So your rent or your mortgage probably isn't going to change if you lose your job. So that's definitely something you want to be able to cover. You need to be able to eat something, but maybe it's grocery store instead of, you know, Starbucks or Ruth Chris.
Yes, I'm definitely guilty of Starbucks. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us again. Stay tuned for next week. We'll be talking about that nasty 4-letter word that starts with a D, and nobody likes talking about debt, but we definitely have to talk about it. It's on our budget. It's required.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Daysha. You guys stay tuned for next week. If you have any questions, go ahead and write them in the comments. We'll be sure to respond over the next couple of days. Again, Frugal Females Challenge is happening the entire month of September. If you're just getting started, don't worry, there's still time to participate. Thanks so much, guys. We'll see you next time.